The story that could overshadow everything Donald Trump is doing across the globe. His former lawyer, Michael Cohen, has now begun a marathon week of Capitol Hill testimony. There's a source telling NBC Cohen spilling on even, quote, criminal conduct while Trump was in office. I can tell you at this hour, Michael Cohen is in the 10th hour of his workday, which is a closed-door meeting with the senators on the Intelligence Committee, and that is, of course, today the first of 3 consecutive days of testimony. Cohen arriving at a secure facility inside the U.S. Senate just before 9 a.m. You see him there walking in, escorted by Lanny Davis, his advisor and a lawyer you've seen probably on this show, among others. He was facing, we're told, quite skeptical lawmakers, particularly since this is the very committee he now confesses he lied to in 2017.
Chairman, what's the most important thing to mark the truth?
Are you sure you can trust Mr. Cohen?
Sure has a track record of questionably doing that.
That's what it looks like when a senator doesn't want to answer questions but can't help himself and answers at least one. Now, Michael Cohen's private testimony has been focused on Russia. That's part of why it's private today, on how long Donald Trump worked on the Trump Tower Moscow project and whether the Russians had any leverage over then-citizen, now President Trump. Cohen won't talk about those Russia probe lines of inquiry in public tomorrow. We know that, but we can also report tonight a source telling NBC there will be other significant political and legal bombshells. Cohen ready to share, quote, anecdotes about Trump's, quote, lies, racism, and cheating as a private businessman, which he saw up close in the decade that he worked for Mr. Trump, evidence of criminal conduct by Trump, and this is key, since he became president. That's what's promised. Also, Cohen bringing the goods on Trump's finances, potentially bringing an actual financial statement. Cohen also says he's basically prepared to give granular details of how Trump was involved in what is now a confessed crime, the scheme to keep Stormy Daniels and another woman quiet during the 2016 campaign. Plus, Cohen saying he will detail why he lied to Congress in the first place about, yes, the Trump-Moscow deal. Now, Donald Trump's defenders are saying, look, you can't believe any of this because Michael Cohen has not only lied before, but admitted to lying. So there's no debate about the fact that he lies at least some of the time. Trump's defenders also note that of these 2 men, as of this hour, only one of them has been convicted of a crime. But that's one piece of this. The other piece is broader, and it's not just about the law. We are headed in tomorrow, seeing the contrast and the climax of a fight between Michael Cohen's world and Donald Trump's world, between the way Michael Cohen says he wants to operate now and how he says Donald Trump has operated for a very long time. Now, Cohen's allies have, I'm sure you've heard the phrase, touted this as a John Dean-style moment, famously invoking a turning point in the Watergate era. Many people say it's time to trust Michael Cohen.
He's saying very clearly that he never directed you to do anything wrong. Is that true?
I don't think there's anybody that believes that.
Is there anyone that believes that? Well, tomorrow is going to be one of the most important days of at least the public side of all of these probes, because tomorrow we hear from Michael Cohen in public. He'll be tested by members of both parties, and Americans will make up their own minds. I want to bring in some experts to break this down. Matt Miller, who worked at the DOJ under President Obama, David Corn, Washington Bureau Chief for Mother Jones, and Juanita Tolliver from the Center for American Progress Action Fund. Thanks to each of you. This is one of those things like when the media overdoes a weather event and the storm hasn't actually hit yet, and people are like, I'm tired of hearing about this storm. And the problem with that, and we're a part of it in the media, but the problem with that is, of course, Matt, tomorrow is when we get the public testimony. So what are you looking to that's actually significant as he goes under oath? And I will say, Mr. Cohen's lied before. I want to be clear about that to viewers, but he goes under oath tomorrow as a person in that rare position of someone who's about to face jail time for, among other things, lying to Congress, which will certainly focus your mind about trying to get it right this time.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. When people talk about the fact that he's lied in the past, look, obviously he has, and I think that's one of the first questions tomorrow for him is, why did you lie? And what I suspect he'll say is what his lawyer said in court papers, which is, essentially, I worked for someone who led an organization, then led a campaign, and now has led a presidency that was basically built on lies and built on deception. And in order to keep up the story that Donald Trump told, I had to lie for him. And sometimes that meant lying publicly, and sometimes that meant coming in and lying to Congress, which I did. But I paid the price for that. And I think think as a viewer, if I were watching this tomorrow and trying to judge what he said, he'll come in and tell his story. I assume the president will deny all of it, probably on Twitter, but if not, in interviews after. And you have to ask yourself,
maybe on Instagram. Who knows?
Yeah,
what medium?
maybe MySpace. Who do you believe? Someone who has admitted to lying, or someone who lies every day, casually, constantly as you and I breathe oxygen, and never once admits to it? I think that when you compare those two, and especially if Michael Cohen brings documentation, as he seems to be indicating he's going to, it's a much easier comparison to make about who might be telling the truth.
This is a blockbuster day, David Corn. Take a look at the chief Democrat on the Intel Committee, Senator Warner. This is brand new. We just got it, about what he's just been hearing in the private session.
The only comment I'm going to make is that 2 years ago when this investigation started, I said it may be the most important thing I'm involved in my public life in the Senate, and nothing I've heard today dissuades me from that view.
David, what's important in your view?
Well, for us to know what he's talking about. I mean, that was testimony that Michael Cohen gave privately today to the Senate Intelligence Committee. He's also talking privately to the House Intelligence Committee, presumably about Trump-Russia-related matters. If there's something that has a senator who's been sitting in the Senate for years saying, I haven't come across anything more important, the American public deserves to know what that is. So we're told tomorrow that Michael Cohen is going to stay away from Russian-related issues. I'm sure he'll be pressed on it, but we'll see how far they can get on that. But we need to know what scared or whatever has upset Mark Warner in that way. And tomorrow, we need to know what Michael Cohen knows about Donald Trump's finances and business dealings, hush money payments. There's a lot of mysteries that me and other reporters have been chasing after, David, for years.
You put it well, which is, have you ever seen on YouTube, they have those reaction videos? You're watching someone react to a big moment, a sports moment, whatever. We just saw Mark Warner's YouTube reaction video to Michael Cohen, but we didn't get to see the underlying video. And so, David, as someone who obviously, I would say, has strong views on this case, you've also been cited in the infamous dossier. You've been at this from the center. You've said people should take some of those Russian dossier basically accounts seriously before that was as common a view, before Mueller was appointed. Some of those things have been borne out. Michael Cohen's listed in the dossier. He denies going to Prague. When you look at all that taken together, David, do you think that there is a way that Michael Cohen could look less than credible tomorrow, or look like it's a bit of a nothing burger if it's all about stuff that he was involved in, like Stormy Daniels, and not the other stuff?
Well, it depends whether he's allowed to answer questions about Russia, and particularly about the Trump Tower deal and what went on there, and why did Trump want to keep it secret? Who asked him to call Putin's office for help, which he did, and how did that play itself out? What is the relationship between Trump and Felix Sater, who Trump lied about, who was the middleman in that deal that would have brought Trump $100 million? Trump said he basically didn't know who he was during the campaign. That was obviously a big, major lie. So there are a lot of Russia-related things, but just as important, there are $300 million in a loan from Deutsche Bank that we fully don't understand that Trump got, other business dealings that are very curious, to put it politely. Those are things that Michael Cohen should be able to talk about. I hope the members of Congress, the Democrats, unfortunately not Republicans, have done their homework and know where to dig.
Yeah, and Juanita, that brings us to something else when David talks about digging, which is there's a whole line of questioning tomorrow, if the members of the committee are prepared, about what Michael Cohen saw with a front row seat about the way Donald Trump dealt with law enforcement and investigations in New York. He said he won't talk Mueller. Okay. What about the Manhattan DA that's looking into Manafort? What about the Attorney General of New York, where Donald Trump clashed with him previously? What about the Southern District, where there have been credible reports he tried to install a loyalist? That's not off the table, according to the memorandum we've seen, the memorandum of understanding from Elijah Cummings. Do you think that's important for Michael Cohen to detail, whether he had a boss who sort of had a habit of alleged obstruction?
Absolutely, and I think it will also continue to paint the case of the influence that Trump had over him as an employer, and how he was Trump's right-hand man every step of the way, the man who was trusted to make the deals, handle the payoffs, and clean up messes. So to really back all this up, I'm looking for Cohen to show the receipts, right? We need to see the evidence of all of this, and this is his opportunity to really lay it out and paint that clear picture of how manipulative Trump was, how many things that he tried to cover up, how many times that he tried to obstruct Justice, because one thing that really perked up my ears on this were criminal actions that Trump did while serving as president. All right, that distinction alone really makes this a level up game.
When you said receipts, do you mean like the cost of his trip down to D.C., or what were you?
I'm talking receipts as in proof of campaign finance violations when he paid off Stormy Daniels and was reimbursed.
Understand the vernacular.
Come on, Ari.
No, I'm just playing. I did understand. Matt Miller, take a listen to Hillary Clinton, who's emerged and is talking about, again, her political theory of why Putin would be so favorable to Trump, in part that he was her enemy. Take a listen.
I spoke out, as I would speak out about, fraudulent elections anywhere, including in our own country. But that just got him so upset. I think he saw me as a worthy adversary, which I think I was. And he clearly favored in the campaign, first in the primary, Bernie Sanders, who had a long history of being very favorable toward Russia. And then he favored Trump, who he had reason to believe would be also incredibly favorable.
Matt, I just wanted to get your read on that and her coming out on that now.
Yeah, look, I think she's absolutely right. I mean, it's very clear that Putin, had serious policy disagreements and had reason to worry about her becoming president. But then I think the thing that differentiated Trump from every other Republican is just how friendly he was towards Putin, really from the beginning of the campaign. And that's one of the important things Michael Cohen can shed light on. He's not going to do it tomorrow, but presumably he's doing it to both intelligence committees, and hopefully we'll see those transcripts. Is why he was so friendly with him early on. Was it because the business deal that Cohen was trying to negotiate? Was it because of hoped for interference by Putin on Trump's behalf in the election? I think we need to find the answer out to those questions. And one of the things that's interesting about these next set of hearings, in some ways it solves a problem that the Department of Justice has and that all of us have, which is we don't know what the Department of Justice is going to turn over to Congress. But if you're either the Southern District of New York and you think that Trump has committed a crime, but you don't know what to do about it because you can't indict him, or if you're Mueller, that you can't. One of the things that you can do, whatever evidence you turn over, and you don't have to worry about whether the Attorney General blocks you or not, you can let witnesses go up and testify to Congress. And so if we see him testifying about potential crimes by the president tomorrow, that's a way for DOJ to get this evidence out in public in a way that they can't do while he's in office, because he's a sitting president who can't be indicted.
Briefly, lightning round, because I got to fit in a break. What is the topic in a word or a sentence that you're most intrigued to hear from him tomorrow? A word or a sentence from Cohen tomorrow. Matt?
Executive 2. Who's the executive? Probably one of the Trump kids who signed off on the payments to Stormy Daniels.
David?
So much. I'd say Trump taxes. Why don't we see them? What is he hiding? Why is he afraid to release them?
Juanita?
Here's the evidence. Here's the records that show that Trump avoided taxes and committed fraud.
All interesting lines of inquiry. If he did 10 hours in private tonight, still going. We'll see what he does tomorrow. Matt, David, and Juanita, thanks to each of you. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.